A Letter from Hawaii by George Bagby, written summer of 2017. When organizations with absurd amounts of grant money offer to fly you to Hawaii, the correct response is to inquire closely into the company one is required to keep while there. Because man is a political animal, the character of one's roommates and colleagues has everything to do with one's happiness in a particular place. Bad company does not only corrupt good morals, but it can also spoil a weekend. My mistake was to ignore all of my previous experiences with that special slice of the civil service called the public school teacher, and imagine that this time they would be better. I did hedge my chances by cultivating contacts with like-minded Hawaiians ahead of time. The journey to the island was unlike any I had yet experienced. The key with long-distance flights, I have found, is to pick a window seat at the very back of the plane and to bring along Anthony Trollope. These seats are usually the last other people will choose for themselves, for everyone else is eager to escape any long metal cylinders they find themselves trapped in for hours on end. I have not followed the herd on this point, and I maintain a childish fondness for the adventure of air travel, and am in no hurry to rush off of a plane. Not only did I have rows to myself across the continent and over the Atlantic, but the flight attendants joined me to chat about books and reminisce about famous passengers. One of them had flown Solzhenitsyn to Magadan when he returned from his Vermont exile to Russia. The sight of the Oregon coast receding while the pilot pointed the plane towards a small speck on the distant ocean gave me a vision of faith and wonder. No crossing of the Atlantic can compare. My classical school colleagues on Oahu were a godsend and were happy to help and host a fellow teacher of our unique stripe. From them I learned that Oahu, the island of Pearl Harbor and Honolulu, was home to 80% of the state of Hawaii, and that the vast majority of food, fuel, and consumables were imported to the island. Everything was quite expensive. Having never been on any small island, Oahu's physical limitations made a deep impression on me. One can see an end of the island from any place on the island except the middle of the Central Valley. The place gave me the impression of a large ship at sea. My classical school colleagues dropped me off at my residence for my stay, and I met my public school companions for the week. The topic of discussion our first night was how to destroy the influence of churches and families over the lives of students. One teacher was cheerfully proposing the destruction of the sexist, patriarchal, propertied, moralistic prejudices of his students and replacing them all with Mill's dictum of experimental living without harming others. I countered with the arguments of Plato's Callicles and Nietzsche, proposing the libido dominandi as both a more attractive, meaningful, and desperately wicked alternative to his naive liberalism. He had set up the Mosaic Law as a target for a moment, and so I suggested that his students, rather than adopt his single rule of nonviolence, would much rather embrace nihilism and commit fornication, murder, theft, and all other things that stuffy old patriarchs like Moses attempted to prohibit with divine authority. The thought shocked him, but he had the consistency to repeat Mill's prohibition on harming others as his standard. I submitted to him that, as a card-carrying, patriarchal, sexist bigot, I was only playing the devil's advocate. But Mill's law wasn't delivered etched in stone with the sound of thunder. One cannot deny knowledge of human nature, debunk all moral limitations and visions of health, and then expect children to act with restraint. Let Plato stand as an eternal, frustrating rock upon which the waves of modernism will break against in vain. Unsurprisingly, none of these teachers were familiar with Plato. My classical school faculty were kind enough to host me and visit with me during my week with these worthy civil servants. They taught me the bus system on the island, which is quite extensive, and fed me the legendary and memorable local fruits. One of my new classical school friends compared the native Hawaiian Polynesians to Southerners, for they were conquered by Northern business interests and yet kept their own songs and memories alive alongside the modern world which engulfs them. This aspect of Hawaii became my favorite thing about the place. The Iolani Palace, the monument for the dispossessed Polynesian monarchy of Hawaii, is the best exhibit of Jacobite style legitimism I have ever seen. Native Hawaiians treasure the memory of their aristocratic, feudalistic, slave owning ancestors, and they keep statues of them in public places. They decorate the statues with flowers. One can only imagine Oak Alley or Monticello presenting the story of their builders with half of the understanding or attempt to measure by the standard of the time. Iolani Palace and the Bishop Museum of Polynesian Culture are both highlights of Oahu, and I must confess my general contempt for American history museums. I can seldom stand them, but the Hawaiian museums gave me great pleasure. My last night in Hawaii began with two of my public school colleagues exchanging kind thoughts on Marx and then asking my opinion. I submitted that Marxism in the 20th century was appalling, and I thought Marx's simplification of history and calls for violence were both false and immoral. Several other teachers turned on my apostate utterances with shock and horror, and I found myself in a new world where all things seemed upside down. I learned much from the first dialogue of the evening. What do you mean that Marxism has a bad record? Well, the genocides of the 20th century, of course, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolsheviks were not Marxists. Lenin was not a Marxist? Of course not. He was an aberration. I see. So Stalin was a Marxist. No, Stalin was not a Marxist. But Lenin and Stalin claimed to be Marxists. It doesn't matter. They were not real, pure, true Marxists. I see. So Mao was a Marxist. No, this is dreadful. Mao was not a Marxist. So we are left with Pol Pot then. This particular teacher, who was increasingly alarmed by my admission that I taught history and political science, was determined to correct my wrong-think, and I allowed for a long conversation on the subject. I began with Marx's assertion that all history was class struggle and all historical cause economic. Human beings, of course, are motivated by any number of things: love of beauty, hatred of beauty, irrational devotion to murderous ideologies, love of a woman, hatred of a woman, and so on. We had a breakthrough, I dare to think, when I asked her what she thought a neo-Nazi was. I asked if she had ever encountered someone who claimed Nazism deserved a second try because Hitler was an aberration who simply misinterpreted an otherwise sound theory to establish utopia. This was the most dangerous part of our discussion, but it held together. We parted with a handshake. She revealed that she was an empathetic atheist who taught a religious appreciation class. I left Hawaii with good friends from the classical school and a resolution to avoid trips that will leave me confined with public school teachers. It also left me with something like an evangelical call to convince God-fearing parents that their students should not be in public schools. I left with regrets that I spent any time trying to prove Mao was a communist instead of eating bananas or watching the tropical fish. The bananas really are quite good, and the bright-colored tropical fish swim in circles around the storm drains that empty into the Honolulu harbor. Nature can absorb incredible amounts of human foolishness without much ill effect. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my work, please consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee page, the link to which you can find at my YouTube channel. Thank you.